Hey guys, how's it going? Such a stupid question, right? um, so I wanted to talk a little bit about something that, for lack of a better phrase or term, unless somebody comes up with one, I see it as like a sort of meta-cognitive sort of suffering, or like a meta-suffering, meta-pain, meta-fear, meta-anger, meta-anxiety. And I want to describe a little bit about how that feels or what it is. And it's something I've come across significantly on the server, this the Zoid Void, as well as people that uh, write to me either email or on the YouTube comments or otherwise. Um, Something that seems to be pretty commonplace for the schizoid, even if like sometimes they don't really quite know what is going on. That's one of the issues too, is that there's some Zoids out there that like aren't quite sure what it is that they're actually doing, especially when it comes to the whole neurodivergent aspects of it that I've discussed thoroughly in other recordings and stuff. It isn't until you give them a little bit of language to work with that they start realizing, oh, is that what I'm doing? That makes sense. And then they could start feeling a little better or start piecing certain things together in a more comprehensible way. But regardless of all that, and regardless of where that particular schizoid might be at on a lot of these things, there's something many of us tend to do, and that is look at ourselves from outside ourselves. Look at a kind of disconnected, almost medical look at our own behavior, at our own psychology, our own actions, motivations, or lack thereof. We'll look at the way we react to things and respond to things, or again, lack of response. And we'll come up with theories and ideas on why we act the way we do, why we do what we do. Is it good? Is it bad? Is it me? Is it them? Is it external? Is it internal? And so on and so forth. And we'll look at other people's behavior because we have to navigate it. Because sometimes we can't even navigate what it is that's going on with us, considering that we feel so detached from it a lot of the time. So then we suffer in these really kind of strange ways that are very unconventional, to say the least. I've had, okay, let me give you a kind of an example. I've spoken to a lot of schizoids that will describe events from their past, right, in a very disconnected fashion, like whether it be, some kind of sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, all kinds of just very traumatic stuff sometimes. Some of it being like traumatic over time sort of stuff. I forgot the term at this point, but it's not some things that would I guess develop into a PTSD or that long term sort of PTSD that I can't remember the terminology for it at the moment. I'm a little tired, and the depression is it's there. It's a little higher than usual at the moment. It's just above low grade for sure. And the idea is that they'll discuss it with me. They'll put that stuff out there for me. But when they're discussing it, they're talking about it in a way that's like they're studying themselves. They're studying how it could have affected them, how it does, how they believe that it has an impact on them in the manner in which they make decisions and their defense mechanisms, their adaptations, theories on the self, and how these traumatic or these not so great things might have developed into what they have currently become, which is, what is deemed to be a schizoid or termed as a schizoid. Right? And oftentimes they'll conflate their odd thinking to their experiences or to that trauma. But many times they're not so much suffering or feeling miserable about the events that actually occurred, but more that they occur at all. more that um, they can't quite grasp or figure out what the concrete aspects of what it is about those concrete traumas have done to them. And a lot of the times, what's interesting is that though the trauma might be seemingly, on that kind of more concrete, middle abstract level of interaction and stuff, the part of it, the part of the trauma that I would argue a neurotypical person would be focused on, would ruminate on, would so on, would have the deepest impact on them. What's odd is many times when these conversations occur between myself and other schizoids, and even on a more interpersonal one-on-one level, when they bring up these things, oftentimes what seems to be the most personally traumatic is what those traumas represent as a whole, what they represent to experience, to life, to them existentially, to what it means about being alive, being a human being, what it represents to them as a sentient life, as Dr. Greenberg had described, some always mentioning that they feel like a floating mind, a floating head, right? How the floating mind is impacted by them on a symbolic level. And you get into these really kind of very strange philosophical places, or what would be deemed philosophical, and it's pretty normal to the schizoid oftentimes, or metaphysical, or transcendental, or whatever you want to call it, right? These preoccupations and concerns are what seemingly creates more sadness, grief, and everything else in association with that trauma than discussing the trauma itself. I could say the same for me. In my case, the more concrete trauma, such as parental neglect and sexual grooming from a neighbor, the more grounded sort of resentment of I wasn't taken care of as a child, sort of stuff, that those kind of things. Those things have, I feel, less of an emotional and devastating impact on me, trauma, if you will, than the more abstract ideas behind those things occurring, why they had to occur, why they did, why people do what they do and allow those things to occur, why this and why that, so on and so forth. And oftentimes those questions about your past, those questions about why certain things are so arbitrary in their occurrence, is what leads a person down this path of detachment, dissociation, anhedonia, abolition. In my opinion, that a lot of that stuff stems more from this region, not so much the events that actually took place in a physical sense. I'm trying to think of a way that I can explain my own in a similar fashion. I've talked about this before. I don't know if I've ever put it in a proper ramble. I think I've discussed it in a stream or something. I'll give it the go, right? I'll give it the go again, so that maybe it's a good anecdote, because I don't like to use other people's stories too much, because a lot of the times, even if they aren't like doxed, or the names aren't said, it might feel like an intrusion for me to mention it. Not necessarily, actually. I don't know. Maybe I'm overthinking it. I'd have to ask the individual and Maybe they would make more sense out of it for me in that way. Anyway, I'll just go with my own, which some of you already kind of heard before. So this is kind of one of the things that I had a breakthrough with my psychologist. When I was, I believe, 7 or 8, I was groomed and I was molested, right? That's how you would term it. That's what you would say. Okay. And, but what was interesting is up until that point, um, I was a child that felt pretty disconnected from my surroundings, from the people, from the behaviors, from the stuff that interested me or brought my attention. Even as simple as maybe a 8-year-old's thoughts may be when it comes to some stuff. Simple in comparison to, what's culminated since then. And because of that, I had trouble emotionally attaching myself to any person or individual. I'm guessing that's part of the reason I don't really have any kind of positive emotional memories regarding childhood. And it wasn't because my home environment was so chaotic or crazy or anything like that, or that my parents were like, actively abusive, um, or anything like that. Um, so there should have been some moments there, but there wasn't. And it's this kind of sense of I I wasn't part of them from like the beginning. It's like I could pick up on it since childhood. But anyway, this thing occurred over the course of, I'm guessing, a few months. And it got to a point where it was the closest to a friend slash sense of intimacy that I had ever developed, even if what was occurring was just so very wrong. But in the mind of that 8-year-old, it felt like a connection. And so I partook in what the grooming led up to. And some aspect of me found a sense of solace, I guess, or something, in finding a connection, as perverse as that connection was. But to my 8-year-old mind, or whatever, 7, I can't even remember the actual year. Maybe not. No, I'm pretty sure it was 7 or 8. It didn't take that way. It wasn't understood that way. Whatever the person doing that stuff to me was intending, or whatever motivated them to do that, was completely detached from my more abstract sense of what it is that was occurring to me. Right? I saw it as intimacy. I saw it as a connection. I saw it as a friend. Something I had never really experienced. But obviously, considering the conditions, should not have experienced in such a manner. But nonetheless, that's what occurred. So I would seek out this person's attention, even when they, didn't necessarily want me around. Um, and obviously, in return of the horrific things that I was partaking in, they continued to give me the sense of closeness and intimacy as a friend that I found so alluring or enjoyable or fulfilling, I guess, when I was a kid that didn't have that very much. It wasn't until I was asked by my mother what was happening after a long time of it happening. And I guess maybe some hearsay got out or something she discovered or saw. I don't know. She asked me, she confronted me about it, and I do remember this. I remember that when I was asked, I was like, oh, yes, yeah, that's exactly what's occurring. I remember she asked me, is somebody doing these things to you? And I said, yes. Yeah, they are. And in my mind, I thought, oh, okay, well, I was told by the person doing these things, obviously in a grooming fashion, that it was a secret. It was a friendship-based, trust thing. It was secret. And so I was more upset that I had to answer this question because I felt like, oh well, I've broken my friendship secret. And I remember when she had, vehemently asked, and I told her, yes, yes, that's what's happening. In my mind, I thought, oh damn, I messed up. I said it, but I didn't think, oh, I'm hiding it because what it was happening was wrong or sick or terrible. I know that much. And so my mother's reaction to her finding out was obviously a very negative one. She was devastated. She was deeply disturbed, and so on and so forth. But what impacted me was that I didn't understand why. I didn't understand why she felt like she did or reacted like she did. Because in my mind, and I want to again state that what happened to me was wrong. It should not have occurred. Um, but I'm just trying to basically relay this as honestly and transparently as possible about how the experience occurred to me. In my mind, nothing bad happened because I associated it to good feelings, something that I'm guessing I lacked. Um, and so, man, should I have done? I don't. Anyway, you guys already listen to my channel. You know how heavy shit can get. Anyway, so it went from that to being told, oh no, this is horrible, so on and so forth. And then my father finding out, and the arguments and problems that came within the family because of this. Other people in my family probably finding out, having to go see a doctor, medical, and probably, at the time, psychological or something. Being told, having it reinforced to me that what had occurred to me was sick and wrong, and I was a victim, and so on and so forth. And in all sense, I'm not denying that was the case. I'm not denying. I'm not going to validate any of that behavior. But inside that 8-year-old's mind, all I heard was that thing that made you feel like you were connecting to someone was wrong and sick and terrible. So then I associated intimacy to the wrong, the sick, and the terrible. Not fully comprehending why that was, but being told that that's what I must do. So I didn't associate the actual grooming and event to wrong, sick, and terrible until much later in life. When I realized what it is that had occurred. But the feeling of intimacy that I had experienced as a neurodivergent kid in such a situation. And that in itself was a source of my, adaptations, along with many other factors. Um, that's more like I would say one of the major components of my schizoid adaptations was that set of events, that trauma of being told that the very thing that you felt, early in life as a connection to another human being was horrific, sinful, and terrible. And any kind of thoughts that I had probably at the time to defend myself or say that no, it wasn't, it was friendship, was obviously, and reasonably so, rebuffed and um, told that I was, confused and that I was this and I was that and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, because of the way I experienced these thoughts, I didn't just associate them to that particular event or that thing. I associated them to the meta of what is intimacy, what is closeness, what is all those things. And so, thus, that's what it became. Now, you compile that with all the disconnect that comes with being neurodivergent, um, and not experiencing the same way and having the same values as other people, and not having the same cares or motivations as everyone around you, even from childhood. And that continuing to be the case on top of this particular event I mentioned, uh, along with other things like bullying and neglect and whatever, everything else that I don't have time to explain now. Um, that is what helped me. That is what created that meta sort of suffering that I'm talking about. And that's, I think, what people get really confused is that if you talk to a lot of schizoids about why they're sad or why they're depressed or what triggers their anhedonia or why they can't find so many things pleasurable, many times they'll have a vast repertoire of philosophical or metaphysical or um, unconventional reasons for why that is. And they'll tie all that into whatever trauma was inflicted upon them, based on the literature, the psychological literature, or their understanding of psychology or human behavior. And all those things culminate into this sort of very um, disconnected from the concrete aspects of their trauma sort of suffering. That's the best way I can describe it. And unfortunately, a lot of the time when you go to therapy or you see a psych or something, they're trying to repair that, right? They're trying to repair that middle abstraction trauma and the suffering and the source that they deem the where it came from, right? Where it developed from, right? And when a psych does that and basically is incapable or doesn't quite understand the more nuanced aspects, the more abstract, the more metaphorical parts, more existential parts of the suffering the schizoid is enduring, they feel as if even within an environment in which they're supposed to be getting help, they're not, and they're not being understood. And many of the times is they've been conditioned to not express these more abstract thoughts about what it is that they're feeling because they'll be seen as either crazy or strange, or they're worried they're going to get institutionalized, or something like that. There's a variety of reasons. Or they've been conditioned by family because whenever they try to express these sort of thoughts, it would just get, again, rebuffed or discarded or ignored or mocked. That's what happens. That's how it develops. And I was discussing with somebody else how that's why I can connect to when schizoids talk to me about their trauma. When they tell me the details of their suffering and the physical, mental, emotional abuse associated to that suffering. Because when they tell me within that landscape that I sort of described, I hope. They tell me within that layer what those things that occur to them mean. And it makes sense to me. That meta suffering, that disconnected sort of look at the self as almost a character in a story, and the things that occur to them and what they represent to the story itself as a narrative, the narrative of their life. They look at their set of tragic events and they don't just see a personal occurrence within the context of their own life. They see it as a story, as a narrative that needs to be dissected. And they find the melancholy, anger, frustration, and so on lies within that narrative. And that's where their suffering comes from oftentimes. And that's something that most psychs don't understand. Unless it's explained to them and they're highly open to accepting that the source is different, the cognition is different, that the value systems and the needs to co-regulate are different. Their emotions get co-regulated in a different way by a different layer. And so that's why schizoids oftentimes can co-regulate each other's emotional moods, because we're coming from the same place. And yes, I know oftentimes a schizoid seems like they have no emotional moods. And many times it's difficult to achieve them because a lot of those aspects are suppressed. But when they do, it's only in the context of being around another individual that can actually co-regulate. Or an individual that can listen and understand and empathize on an effective level. And that's not an easy thing to come across for the schizoid. It's part of what I'm trying to build, why I'm doing this at all. In my mind, I think I want to help rewrite the narrative. I think I want to do something about the symbolic, the metaphorical problem, the story that is life. I want to do something about it for at least people that think like me. It's the best I can do. As cringe as that may sound. Like right now, I'm literally holding the wires on my headphones and just twisting and messing with them because of the amount of discomfort and awkwardness I feel right now talking about these things. Maybe it's awkward for you to hear it. I don't know. It's really difficult. Even now, I can feel my body having some kind of reaction to this thinking, to these thoughts. Thinking about what I'm doing, if it has any impact, if I should keep going, if it means anything at all. Which, as a nihilist, I don't think it does. But as an optimist, I want to keep doing it anyway. What a fool I can be. And then the tears can come forward, and half the time I'm not sure where they're coming from. But they're there. Thank you for listening.